How are you interpreting this strange development?
Well, I think a lot of the answer goes back to a point that John has made in many programs, which is that Trump himself is very much of an outlier here. And he's not only up against the Europeans who have exactly the kind of rationale that John was saying, that they don't want the United States to leave Europe. They want to keep the United States in Europe. That's why they're pushing for security guarantees for Ukraine. That's why they want, if they can't get boots on the ground in Ukraine, an American Air Force patrolling the skies over Ukraine, all of those absurd things. That's why they're talking about this. But he also has to contend with a very, very large community of people in the United States, in the foreign policy establishment, the defense establishment, the media, within his own administration, who are completely unreconciled to what he's trying to do in Europe with Russia, with his wider foreign policy. And I think he tries to move the process forward by doing constantly what John is saying, which is throwing these people a bone, trying to split the difference with them, if you like, hoping that eventually he will get to where he wants to be before they catch up with him and try to pull him back in. I think this is a high risk approach, actually, and I'm not sure this is the correct way to do it, but I think this is how he operates, and I think this is the cause of a great deal of confusion. Can I just say, it's a point I've made already in other venues, which is that when you put aside all the noise and all of the rhetoric and everything that's been coming out over the last week, there has been one public agreement between the Russians and the Americans. And it is the Americans who have agreed that there will not be a ceasefire, that there will be movement towards a full negotiated solution to the conflict, and there won't be a ceasefire in the meantime, which might very easily lead to a freezing of the conflict, or at least that's what the Russians have been afraid of. The Russians have consistently pushed back against the idea of a ceasefire. Trump has now conceded to the Russians on this. So perhaps it's understandable that he's throwing out all of these words, all of this noise about security guarantees, about the Russians agreeing to freeze the front lines in some places if the Ukrainians pull back in other places, in order to keep people talking about these other things, rather than the fact that he's conceded on the point of the ceasefire, which of course leaves the Russians in a position of advantage, because without a ceasefire, they're able to continue advancing and winning the war in Ukraine.
I agree with that 100%. But I would note that once you take the ceasefire off the table and you say that you have to have a final peace agreement, the whole issue of security guarantees is integrated into that final peace agreement. In other words, for security guarantees to be realized, the Russians have to agree in the final peace agreement that security guarantees the which include the deployment of NATO forces on Ukrainian soil, is okay with them. And as we have said, and I think anybody with a triple digit IQ and an interest in facts and logic understands that's not going to happen. The Russians are not going to agree to that in a final peace agreement. So this is not a serious issue. It's just more of the empty debates that we have in the West all the time. I want to talk a little bit about Trump and what's going on here. I think Trump is, in a very subtle and clever way, trying to distance himself from this war and turn the responsibility for managing the war over to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians themselves, of course. Now, Glenn, this is picking up on a point you made. Trump is in a situation where he has to be very careful when the Ukrainian military finally loses in a serious way, that he's not blamed. So what he wants to make sure he does is not cut off the flow of weapons and not cut off intelligence, because he doesn't want to be blamed when Ukraine finally loses. And what he has done here is he's come up with this clever strategy where Europe buys weapons from the United States, Europe pays for those weapons, and Europe ships those weapons to Ukraine. So Trump can say the Ukrainians are still getting American weaponry. It's just that I've been clever enough to get the Europeans to pay for them and ship them to the Ukrainians. So the Biden pipeline is not going to end, but it's not going to be the Trump pipeline, at least from a public relations point of view. It's going to be the European pipeline. It's going to be a bigger pipeline because those American weapons are coming in. So the Ukrainians are going to continue to get weaponry from the West, to include the United States. But Trump is going to be able, in a very subtle way, to distance himself. Then just think about the meeting that he's trying to set up with Zelensky and Putin. You notice he says, I don't want to be there for the first meeting. This is Donald Trump, who's always the master of ceremonies, who always likes to be center stage. He's saying, let Putin and Zelensky get together and solve this one.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is that he understands he can't solve this one.
No.
He can meet with Putin. He and Putin can agree. Alexander was getting at this before. There's not much daylight between Putin and Trump. The problem is that Trump can't sell anything he agrees to with Putin to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. Okay, then let the Ukrainians and the Europeans deal with the Russians. Let them talk to Putin. Let Zelensky get together with Putin. And at the same time, everything that's happening on the battlefield will influence how Zelensky and the Europeans deal with Putin. And Trump surely realizes that with the passage of time, Ukraine, which is already in dire straits on the battlefield, will be in an even worse situation. And there'll be more of an incentive than ever moving forward for the Ukrainians and the Russians to cut, Ukrainians and the Europeans to cut some sort of deal with the Russians. And Trump can sit back, let them do it, and as things deteriorate on the battlefield, he can say, I cannot be blamed for this because I did not cut off the flow of weaponry to the Ukrainians. So I think this is basically what's happening here.
it would be a very clever strategy, though, because again, it's evident that NATO has lost the war. So, if you were advising Trump, this would be a good way to, well, first get your money back. That is to have the Ukrainians hand over, well, some of their minerals. Then, of course, getting the Europeans to accept that they will buy the American weapons to send to Ukraine. That also enables Trump to outsource the containment of Russia to Europe, while he can get along with the Russians, both in bilateral relations and possibly work together in Asia. But and also when the whole thing goes south, the Europeans get to take the fall and blamed for the whole thing. So it does make a lot of sense in terms of losing a war. This is a good way of going out. But I guess my question is, what's in it for the Europeans? Because I see the Europeans, sit there like good schoolboys in the Oval Office. But people like Merz is still suggesting that, we really need this ceasefire, and we commit ourselves to, continuing to fight. Von der Leyen starts to speak of another sanctions package. I'm not sure if this is 19th or 20th. But I'm sure this one will do the trick. But it's. But how do you make sense of the European position? Because I can understand very well that the Ukrainians will have a hard time swallowing this. I understand, for them, the Russians are an existential threat. I understand the Russians, they see NATO in Ukraine is an existential threat. I get the Americans, if they wanted to, want to pull out of this losing war, but I can't make sense of the European position. It's very, very strange to me.
It is very strange, and it's also, can I just say, an extremely undignified position. This is something that even the British media is now talking about. There's been articles in the British media yesterday and today about what a shabby picture the leaders of Europe cut in the White House. They were all there as if they were listening to the school teacher, and that they were being given a lesson. I mean, it was unattractive, but ultimately it all comes back to this desire to keep the Americans in Europe. And what I think they're doing ultimately is they're playing for time, trying to keep the war going, trying to keep the Americans involved, trying to the extent that they can to turn Trump against Putin again. I mean, this still seems to be part of what they're trying to do, and basically wait out Trump, or hope that Trump himself ultimately loses patience with Putin and reverts to the kind of strong position that, as they would say, that Biden had. So I think this is really all they have, and I think that's all they're doing. There are voices of dissent starting to appear. There was an article in the Daily Telegraph, which is an important newspaper, by the way. It's very, very close to the British defence and security establishment, just to say. There was an article by a man called Owen Matthews, who's a well-connected journalist here. And he said, for the first time, that not talking to the Russians for Europe had been a catastrophic mistake, and that the time has come to start negotiations, to start a dialogue, a European dialogue, a proper European dialogue with the Russians. Now, for the moment, that's still unusual. It's the first article of that kind to have appeared, but a swallow might point to the coming of summer. We'll just have to see.
I have a question for both of you as Europeans. Do you think that the European elites, the present cast of characters who are running the European countries, except for maybe Viktor Orban and one or two others, do you think they view Russia as an existential threat? When I listen to European leaders and lots of European commentators talk, it seems to me that they've convinced themselves that Russia is going to take all of Ukraine, it's going to conquer countries in Eastern Europe, and it is a serious threat to Western Europe. And if we don't stop them now, we're going to pay a god awful price down the road. I mean, I think this is ludicrous, and I know you two do as well. But do you think that the governing elites in Europe seriously believe that Russia is an existential threat?
Well, it's hard to be. I mean, it's possible that they have convinced themselves, but I find it strange because people like Macron, in her time Merkel as well, they all recognize the dangers of trying to construct a Europe without Russia, more or less recognizing it would unavoidably become a Europe against Russia. And so it kind of contradicts with some of the former statement, but also if Russia's really an existential threat, why haven't we been building proper armies? Why not join the fight with the Ukrainians? Why aren't we trying to take Moscow if we really think we're fighting Hitler here? I mean, this is very, very strange. I think it's a bit like the security guarantees. I think the main purpose, the reason why you want security guarantees with the Americans is to lock in the Americans on the continent that the US won't pull out of this transatlantic partnership. I think they see the world going in a multipolar direction. They're doing what they can to keep the Americans there. When they signed this god awful trade agreement with the EU, even the EU officials were recognizing, well, it's not just a trade agreement. We have to strengthen the partnership and try to elevate the role or the value of Europe for the Americans. So I have a hard time believing it. On the other hand, human beings were vulnerable a bit to groupthink, or we subordinate our rationality to this group psychology. And when every politician, every newspaper, every TV station says exactly the same thing, anyone who dissents or criticizes this is immediately a Putinist, and that what do you call it? Almost like a fifth columnist. It's after a while, after 3.5 years, I think it's just very difficult for anyone to push back. I don't know. I at least spoken to several former diplomats in this country who would say, yeah, of course, this is crazy, this is nonsense. But no one would actually speak up because, you would have your head chopped off. So it's, it might be some mass delusion, but I think it's fake, but that's my opinion.
Well, I think this is right. I mean, hysteria, when it is so widespread, does pull in an awful lot of people. And a lot of this probably conceals deep doubts. I suspect that it's different in different places. So if we're talking about the Baltic states, which of course very small, but which wield an enormous amount of influence, I suspect that there, some of the Baltic leaders probably do generally believe much of their rhetoric. They're very close to Russia. These countries were part of the Soviet Union and then the Russian Empire. Until very recently, they feel very vulnerable and they're very nervous of Russia, and they've got historical reasons to be. And I think this rhetoric, when it comes from them, probably has some basis in truth, in some genuine belief behind it. If you're talking about Spain, then they don't believe it at all. I mean, the Spanish government not only is resisting putting up defense spending to 5% of GDP, but it's actually passing off some of its welfare and civilian infrastructure spending as defense spending in order to massage the statistics. Italy, by the way, is doing the same. The British government talks incessantly about an existential threat from Russia, but it's only going to bring defense spending up to 5% of GDP, if it ever does, by 2035. So, what is supposed to happen between now and 2035? So, there is a lot of rhetoric, a lot of worry, a lot of anger, a lot of fear that the Americans are going. But I don't think amongst the bigger states, this reality, this real fear, if you get below the hysteria, is really there. What I think perhaps does play a role and which drives it to some extent is this: if the Americans were to leave and the Russians were to come out of the war appearing to be the winners, then a lot of the processes of European construction that we have seen play out over the last 3 decades, the way in which the European Union has been built up, the way it's been organized, all of that would indeed be under challenge. And of course, with that, the political positions, not just of individual politicians and leaders in Europe, but of some of the political forces that they lead, would find themselves under challenge as well. So it may not be an existential threat from Russia in the sense of the Russians marching into Europe, taking everything over, and changing everything and subordinating it to themselves. But it could lead to a different Europe from the one we have now. And those who are invested in the existing Europe would probably be very alarmed by that prospect.
Can
Well,
I just
you
add the? Oh, sorry.
no, I was just going to
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry. You first.
No, I was going to say Alexander took the words right out of my mouth. That I think that is what's going on. I put just a finer point on it by saying that the package of developments that you described could be defined as an existential threat. In other words, the end of NATO and America pulling out of Europe in a serious way, coupled with a Russian victory in Ukraine, that whole package could be seen as an existential threat. So it's not just Russia per se, as you were saying, that the elites are so concerned about. It's the whole package.
Well, I just want to say, well, I think the Russia being the new, trying to restore the Soviet Union. Obviously, this is all nonsense. But that being said, you can't really rule out that the relationship isn't going to go back to the way it was when this war is over. It's worth knowing that the Europeans tended to be a bit cautious. If you remember, the Germans limited themselves to sending helmets. They didn't want to end up provoking a military response from the Russians. Well, in this war, though, we really went all in. That is, the Europeans now have become, well, supported and been complicit in the killings of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers for 3.5 years. They talk about the strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield, destroying its economy, isolating it in the international system, putting pressure on other countries to do so. You had Kaja Kallas talking about breaking up Russia into smaller nations. Similar comments from the Polish president. He called it a Russia prison of nations, 200 nations captured in Russia. I mean, this is we, as I said, we went to really all in on this, and we would never have done so if the United States didn't stand right behind us. And now the war is lost, and the Americans are walking away. This is a very, very exposed position. So I do, on some level, understand why the Europeans now are, well, getting a bit nervous, but this feels like doubling down when it's obvious that the Americans will leave. This will be the time to try to kiss and make up, I would think. But yeah, I don't know. This would be, from my perspective, a legitimate concern, which the Europeans should have for Russia. Because there's a lot of anger now in Moscow towards the Europeans, especially the Germans.
Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, where does this leave us? Where are we headed? I mean, I think it's quite clear that we all agree that you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. If anything, it seems like the distrust on both sides is growing. The mere fact that we're even discussing whether the Europeans think Russia's an existential threat, and you, Glenn, just said that the Russians are angry toward the Europeans for understandable reasons from their point of view, and especially angry towards the Germans. And the Germans are as hardline as the French and the British. I mean, where does this leave us? There's, I think, no way you're going to get a meaningful peace agreement. And as Alexander emphasized before, the ceasefire is off the table. So again, it just seems to me it all comes down to what happens on the battlefield.
Absolutely, it's exactly that. That is what's going to happen on the battlefield. And here, just to make an observation, which is that those who've been following the battlefield closely, which is all three of us, have been discussing many times the importance of the fighting in Donbass and the way the Russians have come up against the last big barrier there. And one of the useful things that's come out over the discussions of the last week is that there's finally an admission in the media at large, at least here in Europe, about the fact that this is basically the big fortified barrier that Ukraine has been defending itself behind, and that if it is broken, then Ukraine is going to be in very difficult position indeed, not just in terms of Donbass, but in terms of its overall position. Now, I remain of the view that despite all that we've been hearing about, the Russians, the distrust in Europe, there are continuing concerns about the US. They would still prefer a peace agreement. I think that what the Russians are probably hoping is that as they break through this last remaining big barrier, as they see their army becoming more successful on the battlefields, over the course of a negotiating process, there will be more and more pressure, ultimately from the Americans, upon the Ukrainians to make more and more concessions, leading to something very close to what the Russians proposed in Putin's speech to the foreign ministry last year. I still think the Russians don't want to go to Western Ukraine. I'm not convinced they want to cross the river, the Dnieper. I don't think they want to do any of those things. That would be, from a Russian point of view, the optimal outcome. The danger is that with this animus towards them that John was talking about, the Europeans don't see this. The Ukrainians refuse to see this. They go on fighting and continue to fight, even as the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass break down. They spurn any American attempts to get the Europeans, the Ukrainians, to come to terms with the Russians on the kind of terms that we've just been talking about. In which case, of course, the Russians will break through to the river. And then we will have a crisis on our hands much bigger than the one we have now. Because the Russians might not want to cross the Dnieper, but they might feel that they have no choice. And we are in exactly that desolate situation that, John, you've warned about in many, many programs that we've done and in many, many places where we have an indefinite crisis in Europe with two armed forces facing off against each other. The Russians positioned where they don't want to be, where there's no real agreements between either of the sides, and Europe is in a state of continuous military confrontation against Russia, which doesn't want to be in that position either, but which also finds itself there. So that I'm afraid is a very real possibility. And it depends on, to avoid it, it depends on a level of statesmanship from the leaders of Europe, which we have absolutely not seen up to now, and which would mean them going back on their rhetoric and doing what Owen Matthews was talking about in the Daily Telegraph, which is beginning their own contacts with Moscow, of which for the moment it must be said they show no sign.
I'd just like to say a few words about the course of the war.
Yeah.
If you sort of look at what's going on in the battlefield, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are suffering enormously from the fact that they don't have enough infantry. And you need a lot of infantry to populate the forward edge of the battle area, what we used to call, when I was in the military, the FIBA. And they just don't have enough infantry. And as time goes by, I think the infantry forces thin out even further. So just looking at the battlefield itself, it's just hard to see how the Ukrainians can stem the tide, much less reverse it. And then you go to the home front. Public opinion in terms of support for the war has tanked. It looks like around 70% of Ukrainians want to settle this one. They've had enough of the war. So when you put what's happening on the battlefield together with what's happening on the Ukrainian home front, it's hard to see how they can sustain this war for a long period of time. And then take it even a step further. The Americans, the Ukrainians surely understand both the body populace and people on the front lines and the elites the Americans are slowly but steadily divorcing themselves from this conflict. That can't help but have a negative effect on Ukraine's sort of willingness to continue this conflict. You would just think that this can't last that long from a Ukrainian point of view. I understand that Ukrainian nationalism is really a powerful force that allows the Ukrainian military to fight under the most adverse circumstances and to do remarkably well given the disadvantages they've had up to now and will have moving forward. It's quite amazing how hard-nosed and tough the Ukrainians are. But at the same time, that was true of the Germans in World War One. And in 1918, they had just had enough. Events on the home front brought the Germans to their knees, coupled with what was happening on the battlefield. And it's hard to see that not happening here. And I think when that happens, it's going to be a devastating blow for NATO. Uh, and as we were saying before, you want to remember that what Trump is trying to do here is he's trying to shift responsibility for the war to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. And he's trying to back off himself. And he wants to leave himself in a position where he's not exposed because he's giving weapons through the Europeans. So I think the Europeans are going to end up with egg all over their face. And by the way, one other argument that Trump can make is, listen, I talked to Putin in Alaska. Putin and I were willing to settle this one. And it was the Europeans and the Ukrainians who were roadblocks. And now that things are going south, you want to blame me. Don't blame me. If you had listened to me after Alaska, we could have solved this one then. But you wanted to continue fighting. I didn't. Look what's happened. We've lost this war. And really, when you get right down to it, you, Europe, and you, Ukraine, have lost the war. So I think that's sort of where we're headed here. It's hard to say for sure, but it certainly looks that way to me.
Yeah.
Well, we just discussed the rationality of threat analysis in terms of whether Russia's trying to restore the Soviet Union. But I think this is also a problem with the analysis of the front lines, because I keep hearing in all media reports from politicians when they want to build up a case why we should continue these wars. Well, the front lines haven't really moved that much. If you look at the big Ukrainian map and it's full, it's only tiny slivers the Russians are able to take. So it's this glacier speed. But from my perspective, this is very dishonest, because this is this is a war of attrition. I feel like made that point until I was blue in the face. That is, you don't storm heavily fortified defensive lines and bleed out all your forces and equipment in a war of attrition. You destroy the enemy, and once they're destroyed, as exhausted, and as John suggested, when they're not able to man the front lines anymore and there's more holes popping up, then you go for the territory. And I feel this is the moment we're currently in. Big places like Kupiansk is being encircled, Pokrovsk is encircled, Konstantinivka not just encircled, semi-encircled that is, but the Russians have now entered the city as well. If this falls, combined with the breakthrough north of Pokrovsk, they can begin to encircle slowly both Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. This is going to be very problematic. You're going to have logistics cut off. The Russians will be able to build up more forces closer to the front line, as well as the logistics. The Ukrainians don't have that many front lines which are reliable. As we often see at the end of wars, the casualties begins to spike on the Ukrainian side. More desertions, people don't want to fight anymore. You're seeing all of these things happening now. And but when you address the analysis coming from especially the European politicians, it's like, well, this war could last for another 100 years. Look how slowly the movements are forward. But that doesn't really mean much when there's no more soldiers to hold the front lines anymore. Suddenly you see huge groups of soldiers being encircled, captured, killed. Things are going to go from bad to worse very soon, I think. So it just feels Trump is ready to save the day for the Europeans, and we're fighting him to the bitter end. It's very strange to watch.
Well, I agree with that completely. And I would add that we don't actually have much time in Europe to prevent the worst, because, of course, if there is a Ukrainian collapse in the front lines, if the Russians reach the battle through to the Dnieper, or something like that happens, then we're in a very, very difficult position indeed. And all of this constant rhetoric about the Russians only moving a few hundred yards or whatever it is, and that the war will go on for another 4 years, and that the Russians will lose, was it 2 million men or something like that, capturing the remainder of Donbass. All of this, all that it does is it reinforces apart from being very cruel, it reinforces a dangerous complacency in Europe that we have plenty of time and that we can maybe wait this out and string the Americans along and keep the Ukrainians still fighting. And then Trump will go away and things will be all right somehow in some kind of a way. I don't think we do have an infinite amount of time. I think we have very, very short amount of time. I mean, I think that what John's analysis about the state of the conflict is absolutely correct. But one has to break through this conceptually as well to understand that we are closer in Europe, specifically in Europe, to a much bigger crisis than we believe ourselves to be in. And that might not be that far away. It might be months away, certainly not years. And the United States, to repeat again many times, the United States it's an ocean away. It's well protected. It's huge. It's rich. It can get by whatever happens. It won't be directly affected. But if we end up in a situation in Europe where the Russians battle through to the Dnieper, and we still haven't come to any kind of agreement with them, and we might have political chaos in Ukraine, and the Russians might feel obliged, because they don't want chaos on their borders, to move beyond the Dnieper or something like that, then we would be in that situation of desolation that John has talked about in many programs,